Hey, welcome to Socialism for All. This file is being recorded for the May 2024 edition of Socialism for All, and it's an audiobook and discussion of Lavender and Red, sections 13 through 16 by Leslie Feinberg from 2004. If you like this video, please click like and subscribe, and consider supporting on Patreon or buy me a coffee at patreon.com/socialismforall or buymeacoffee.com/socialismforall. There are links to Patreon and Buy Me a Coffee in the video description. So we are continuing the series. Parts 1 through 12 are already up on the channel. We have a playlist for those, and I will link to that in the video description. I also want to thank the Workers' World Party for making this work available under a Creative Commons license, and it is available as a PDF from their website, workers.org. So let's begin. Part 13, 1930s USSR, Survival with Setbacks. Male same-sex love was recriminalized in the Soviet Union in 1933. In 1936, measures were introduced banning abortion and making divorce more difficult to obtain. Abortion for medical reasons was restored in 1955, and free abortion on demand was re-legalized in 1968. Upon seizing state power in October 1917, the Bolsheviks had struck down the Tsarist laws against homosexuality and abortion, and eased restrictions on divorce. Why then this political reversal after more than a decade and a half? For die-hard anti-communists, no explanation of why setbacks occurred in the Soviet Union will convince them that in its more than 7 decades of development, there was still much worth defending from the point of view of the working class. But for those who study past revolutions in order to strengthen the modern movement to achieve socialism, a system that will flourish in a planned world economy, a much more thorough explanation of this period is essential, and no glib answers should be accepted as good coin. The seizure of state power by the numerically small Russian working class, allied with the vast peasantry, did not establish socialism. A revolution is not a single act, it is a process. The state based on this workers' revolution liberated turf on which to build a planned economy, which, to be socialist, had to build the economic base of the impoverished, war-torn country in order to breathe life into the demands of the revolution: peace, bread, and land. Russia was still semi-feudal and semi-colonial, the weakest link in the capitalist chain, technologically underdeveloped. This was the material reality. People, quote, make their own history, Karl Marx wrote, but they do not make it just as they please. They do not make it under circumstances chosen by themselves, but under circumstances directly encountered, given and transmitted from the past. That's quoting from the 18th Brumaire of Louis Bonaparte. We have that here on the channel. And commenting, that is to say, the choices that we make regarding the conditions we encounter don't emerge in a vacuum, or from a purely chaotic random process. They're part of a long lineage of the momentum of history. That is our starting point wherever we find ourselves. Continuing. Cleaning the Augean stable. If all the Bolsheviks had to do was get rid of the dominant ideas of the old exploiting class, ideas which had permeated the population of laborers in the fields and the factories: national chauvinism, anti-Semitism, misogyny, anti-gay and anti-trans attitudes, superstition, the task of cleaning this Augean stable would have been formidable. But in order to change social ideas, it was necessary to change the material conditions, to raise the productive level in the workers' state. And world imperialism, howling like ravenous wolves at its borders, did everything possible to hamper that historic effort. Lenin wrote concretely about this in 1919 in relation to women's liberation, quote, "Not a single democratic party in the world, not even the most advanced bourgeois republic, had done in decades so much as 100th part of what we did in our very first year in power. We actually razed to the ground the infamous laws placing women in a position of inequality, restricting divorce and surrounding it with disgusting formalities, denying recognition to children born out of wedlock, enforcing a search for their fathers, etc. Laws numerous survivals of which, to the shame of the bourgeoisie and of capitalism, are to be found in all civilized countries." Unquote. However, he concluded, quote, "Notwithstanding all the liberating laws that have been passed, woman continues to be a domestic slave, because petty housework crushes, strangles, stultifies, and degrades her, chains her to the kitchen and to the nursery, and wastes her labor on barbarously unproductive, petty, nerve-wracking, stultifying, and crushing drudgery. The real emancipation of women will begin only when a mass struggle is started against this petty domestic economy, or rather when it is transformed on a mass scale into large-scale socialist economy." That's quoting from A Great Beginning. Herculean tasks. The dead hand of the past handed the Russian Revolution three enormous responsibilities. Quote, "The new infant workers' state, the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics," wrote Workers' World Party founder Sam Marcy, quote, "had thrust upon it three Herculean tasks utterly unprecedented in the entire history of the class struggle. It had the duty and obligation to reorganize on a revolutionary basis the left wing of the social democratic movement, put it on a communist basis, and lay the foundation for a new and revolutionary international. Lenin and the Bolsheviks were thus obligated from the start not only to give revolutionary leadership at home, but, in a way, to become the general staff of the world revolution, which seemed visible on the horizon, especially in Western Europe and later in the East and China. Its second task, no less urgent and intimately connected with it, was for the new workers' state to defend itself against the most barbaric assaults by the united front of the imperialists, from Vladivostok to Murmansk. And thirdly, it had to begin to lay socialist economic foundations and raise the living standards of the workers and peasants who had passed through a most horrible period of destruction, civil war, and famine." That's quoting from The Significance of Euro-Communism, 1977. Lenin, the leader of the Bolshevik seizure of power, was no utopian. He had no illusions that the capitalist class in Russia, or the enraged imperialists who surrounded the young workers' state, would be won over by moral suasion to stop attacking the revolution. In fact, he and other revolutionary leaders did not think the workers' state could survive long without the support of workers and oppressed peoples around the world, rising up in a groundswell of revolution in order to provide material support, globalizing socialism. In Lenin's report to the 8th Congress of the Bolshevik Party on March 18, 1919, on behalf of the Central Committee, he said that it, quote, "is inconceivable for the Soviet Republic to exist alongside of the imperialist states for any length of time. One or the other must triumph in the end," unquote. A year earlier, on April 23, 1918, Lenin had explained to the Moscow Soviet, quote, "We are a revolutionary working class contingent that has advanced to the forefront, not because we are better than other workers, not because the Russian proletariat is superior to the working class of other countries, but solely because we were one of the most backward countries in the world. We shall achieve final victory only when we succeed at last in conclusively smashing international imperialism, which relies on the tremendous strength of its equipment and discipline. But we shall achieve victory only together with all the workers of other countries of the whole world. Our backwardness has put us in the forefront, and we shall perish unless we are capable of holding out until we receive powerful support from workers who have risen in revolt in other countries," unquote. Something had to give, Marcy stressed. While the result was not the dismantling of the workers' state and its economy, as the imperialists had hoped, some of the social gains of the early revolution were set back. The most left-wing militants in the Bolshevik Party, if they had not died on the front lines defending the revolution, were being pushed back in an internal struggle, and the population was exhausted by imperialist war and intervention, famine, and want. Revolution bent, but did not break. Any study of how and why important political rights that had been won for same-sex love and women were reversed in the Soviet Union in the 1930s has to take into consideration the effects that encirclement, economic embargo and isolation, sabotage, civil war, and other weapons of unrelenting attack by world capitalism had on this vast but economically underdeveloped country. Stripping historical reality from these steps backward does historic injustice to the tens of millions of workers and peasants of many nationalities, sexes, genders, and sexualities who built the revolution with their sweat and defended it against the onslaught of world imperialism with their blood. And it merely fans the flames of anti-communism, serving to derail the forward motion of the planet's working class and oppressed peoples toward genuine liberation. An honest look at the measures taken against male homosexuality and abortion in the 1930s Soviet Union must ask, what effect did the low level of the productive apparatus and the high level of scarcity and deprivation have on the political goals of the Bolshevik Party? How did this frustrate the early goals of achieving the liberation of women and greater freedom of sexuality from state regulation? With the danger of a new and even more destructive imperialist war gathering like a storm against the workers' state, creating an imperative need to quickly build a military force capable of defending the Soviet population, how did the industrialization and rapid collectivization of the peasantry in the 1930s produce a sea change in the spheres of women's societal role and official attitudes towards gender expression and sexuality? And perhaps most importantly, did these political reversals mean, as some said, that the Soviet Union ceased to be a workers' state that deserved the support of laboring and oppressed peoples around the world as it fought for its very life against world imperialism? Part 14. 1930s Soviet Union, a seismic gender shift. The political backslide that resulted in the recriminalization of male homosexuality and banning of abortion in the 1930s in the Soviet Union did not take place in an economic, military, or social void. The point of examining these conditions is not to excuse them away, but to serve as a tool for today's movement for socialism to strengthen its understanding of revolutionary process. Women's and same-sex rights had been politically catapulted ahead by the 1917 Russian Revolution, but when the isolated, impoverished, and embattled workers' state could not raise the living standards of the population quickly enough to provide economic and social freedom from the old patriarchal, heterosexual nuclear family bequeathed by class society, then both women's rights and same-sex rights suffered setbacks. The broadest outlines of this economic crisis are apparent in the efforts to liberate Soviet women. William H. Mandel, in his book Soviet Women, noted that after the seizure of state power in October 1917, quote, "In a matter of months, the new government legislated more than the upper-class feminists had ever asked for. Suffrage, or the right to vote, of course, divorce and civil marriage laws, which made marriage a voluntary alliance, elimination of distinctions between legitimate and illegitimate children, employment rights equal to those of men, equal pay for equal work, universal paid late pregnancy and early maternity leave. Overnight, the status of women in Russia became far and away the world's most advanced," unquote. But the revolution had been made in a single city, Petrograd, which at that time was the capital, and then spread to Moscow. The country was left technologically underdeveloped as a result of feudalism and the greed of foreign imperialism, and its working class was tiny. The cities were isolated and famished. By early 1918, with German troops still occupying much of the grain-producing West, workers in the cities were surviving on starvation rations, nothing but 4 ounces a day of bread. A combined force of the imperialists, forces loyal to the ousted provisional government, and the monarchists tried to launch a counter-revolution, trying to roll aside obstacles. Writing in 1971, Soviet scholar Helen Emelianova commented about the early workers' state, quote, "An acute contradiction had arisen. The participation of female workers in the socialist revolution was considerable, but immediately after the revolution, their numbers were extremely few among members of the party, in the Soviets, in factory committees, in trade unions," unquote. Mandel stressed, quote, "Peasant women, 4/5 of the total female population, housewives, a majority among urban women, and house workers, an extremely large group, had hardly been involved at all," unquote, in the revolution. To address the critical need to reach out to masses of women, the Bolsheviks organized the first Russia-wide Congress of Women Workers and Peasants in November 1918. No men were present at the meetings. About 300 to 500 women were expected. 1,147 attended. One delegate described the goal of the Congress's work, quote, "to explain their rights to the millions of women in even the most remote corners of the country, and call upon them to take an active part in building a new life," unquote. One of the revolutions of the Congress stressed that, quote, "housework is a heavy burden on female workers and peasants, and negating the 8-hour workday for them interferes with their becoming revolutionaries," unquote. The delegates decided to organize special groups for women, and the communists urged their party to set up a women's department. Although some currents of men in the party reportedly argued that this would, quote, "divide the working class along sex lines," they did not predominate. The Bolshevik Party Women's Department, known as the Janat-Del, was established in 1919, even as civil war ravaged the workers' state. The following year, in 1920, 60,000 women were elected to organize women. At Lenin's insistence, this work was paid so that they could be full-time organizers. However, even with small stipends, these women could reach only about 2% of the female population, mostly urban. During the 1920s, Janat-Del worked to liberate women from exhausting individual housework and led attempts to create socialized childcare, large-scale dining halls, and public laundries. Janat-Del's rationale was that, quote, "socializing this work would bolster the new socialist economy by replacing the inefficiencies of individual women's household labor with economies of scale, and would also raise productivity by shifting millions of new workers into Soviet industries, unquote, according to historian Thomas T. Schrand in his essay, Socialism in One Gender. Women would not only be socially equal to men, they would break out of stultifying isolation, become productive members of society in the fullest sense of the word, and thereby contribute their skills and insights to the revolutionary process for social progress. Dead hand of history, iron fist of imperialism. These Bolsheviks were not utopian socialists, however. Quote, the Jeune Adel approach to liberating women involved integrating them into a super-productive socialist economy that would be created following a global, or at least continental, revolution, Schrand notes. Continuing the quote, in this scenario, Russia would have access to the rest of Europe's technology and resources, which would allow it to modernize its economy and to invest in the infrastructure of nurseries, daycare centers, and other institutions that would make women's emancipation possible. Unquote. The defeat of revolutions in Germany and elsewhere dashed these hopes. The fists of capital were clenched and striking the workers' state externally and internally. The country was surrounded and invaded by imperialist armies soon after it first liberated territory to begin building socialism. And as a result, the dead hand of the past weighed heavily on the revolution. The population was hungry and exhausted by war. The Bolshevik Party had lost many of its most revolutionary elements in the struggle to defend the workers' state. Lenin, the leader of the October 1917 revolution and architect of the early years of socialist construction, had died in 1924 from complications resulting from an assassination attempt. It took many years before the benefits of a planned economy reached the people. Between 1924 and 1934, the phenomenon of postcard divorces grew. Under the new marriage laws, a spouse could simply inform the authorities that the marriage had dissolved. Mandel wrote that, quote, if the other party was not physically present, a form postcard would break the news. The major intent of the law was to free millions of women who had been married off against their will under traditional patriarchal procedures. It proved catastrophically counterproductive. Women lost the protection against abandonment with a child or children they had formerly had. Unquote. Material need, not love, was still the most important impetus for many marriages. The technologically underdeveloped workers' state continued to be racked by internal class warfare. During the new economic policy in the early 1920s, when the market in agricultural goods was restored after the war, rich peasants, kulaks, withdrew food from the cities in order to drive up prices. This virtual starving of the city workers spurred on the decision by the leadership to collectivize agriculture. Industrialization and its impact on women. The task was still clear and compelling. The workers' state had to build up industry and hike productivity to meet the needs of its vast population. But a constant state of capitalist siege hampered that urgent objective. Quote, rather than retreating from the goal of socialism, Schrand states, Stalin and his followers decided that the USSR would have to create the economic prerequisites for it in isolation, while surrounded by hostile capitalist powers. From this perspective, the campaign for industrialization and modernization became, among other things, a desperate struggle to arm the Soviet Union for the defense of socialism. Unquote. The first five-year plan, ratified by the party in 1928, set a goal of a 250% growth in overall industrial development and a 330% increase in heavy industry. All industries and services were nationalized by the workers' state. Thousands of new factories and industrial centers were constructed throughout the Soviet Union, and productivity was planned by quotas. However, the investment required to build heavy industry created painful shortages in consumer goods and services. The five-year plan also attempted to rapidly convert small-scale peasant agriculture into large-scale state collective farms. Resistance from the peasantry, particularly the wealthy kulaks, created a disastrous and widespread famine. The threat facing the workers' state, from within and from without, was enormous. Schrand offers his insight into the enormous impact that this swift industrialization had on Soviet women. Quote, between the years of 1929 and 1941, Soviet society experienced what might be described as a gender quake, a seismic shift in sexual divisions of labor produced by the largest national peacetime expansion of women's employment in world history. As a result of this rapid industrialization campaign, over 10 million women began wage labor in the industrial and service sectors of the Soviet economy. The Soviet government actively recruited women for industrial employment, created affirmative action programs to train female technicians and skilled workers, and greatly expanded childcare and cafeteria facilities to free working women from some of their domestic obligations." Unquote. Steps forward and backward. The continuing threats from imperialism required a mobilization to defend the Soviet Union, and that demanded development of heavy industry and military growth. The marshalling of so much investment of the USSR's resources in these branches of manufacturing, Schron stressed, quote, came at the expense of the light industries, which not only employed many women, but also produced the consumer goods that might have lightened their domestic labor. The new priorities also restricted the construction of cafeterias, laundries, daycare centers, and other institutions necessary for Bolshevik-style women's emancipation, unquote. In 1930, Jonatel, weakened since the late 1920s, had been formally abolished. Quote, the Soviet government actually began developing a 5-year plan for women's labor, but the effort to mobilize women was not accompanied by a commitment to freeing them from domestic labor, Schron continued. Although social services did expand somewhat during the 1930s, they did so within limits, and only to the extent necessary to recruit a certain number of women workers, unquote. The formal liberation of peasants from serfdom in 1861, the creation of urban industrial centers, and the dislocation and carnage of the First Imperialist War had shaken the medieval patriarchal family structure. Now this rapid industrialization was also having a profound impact on the sexes, and it was in this period that official attitudes toward gender expression and same-sex love were also shifting. Part 15. Sex and Gender in 1930s USSR. The question of when male homosexuality was recriminalized in the Soviet Union is easy to determine, 1933 to 1934. Why such a regressive move occurred is, while politically indefensible, not inexplicable. The Tsarist anti-homosexual legislation had been removed by the revolutionary Bolshevik leaders immediately after the October 1917 revolution. When the Russian Soviet Federal Socialist Republic first codified its own laws in 1922 and 1926, no anti-gay laws were written. As late as 1929, the top medical body in the Soviet Union, the Expert Medical Council of the Commissariat of Health, held a conference to take up questions of homosexuality, cross-dressing, transsexuality, and intersexuality, sometimes referred to as hermaphroditism. These deliberations did not demonstrate a uniform view, nor were they devoid of the prejudices or limitations on understanding of that era, but they were taken up with genuine scientific concentration. And the impact of, and respect for, the work of Dr. Magnus Hirschfeld, a leader of the German homosexual emancipation movement, was still apparent in the USSR. Prominent clinical psychiatrist P.B. Ganushkin said that he, quote, constantly encountered requests for surgical sex change. Biologist N.K. Koltsov asserted, ahead of his time, quote, of course, there is no intermediate sex, but rather an infinite quantity of intermediate sexes, unquote. Some doctors defended cross-dressing females, described as very masculine, and proposed that they have a right to marry women. Koltsov, showing his confines of consciousness, disputed this, saying a law should be written to block a cross-dressed female from wedding a woman. But historian Dan Healy notes in his book, Sexual Desire in Revolutionary Russia, that, quote, the minutes record no support from colleagues, unquote, and Koltsov's suggestion didn't find its way into the final conference resolution. However, the two-line struggle taking place in the USSR at the time, nature versus nurture, was visible even during the 1929 deliberations, and this ideological battle would have great bearing on subsequent official views of homosexuality and transgender. A strong current of scientists looked favorably on cross-dressing masculine females believed to be lesbians. Their condition was seen as biologically based. They were considered strong and loyal to the workers' state, particularly those in the Red Army. But they considered feminine, cross-dressing males, presumed by all to be homosexual, a dangerous weakness in the ranks of the military. And this form of self-expression and sexuality was seen to be a problem of beat or social life. This nature versus nurture debate at the 1929 conference later emerged more visibly as a two-line struggle that reshaped the direction of the scientific and political approach to questions of same-sex love. The 1930 Great Soviet Encyclopedia extended strong support to Hirschfeld's homosexual emancipation movement. Quote, in 1930, Sereysky's Great Soviet Encyclopedia article on the same topic linked the endocrinological hypothesis to a robust endorsement of Hirschfeld's campaign for homosexual emancipation and for the integration of the alienated homosexual, quote, into the new collective, unquote, Healy notes. The encyclopedia entry stressed that criminalizing homosexual men was an illustration of the cruel and irrational acts of bourgeois jurists. But a, quote, ethnographic sketch, unquote, included by the editors as an appendix penned by P. Preobrazhensky about homosexual love among the peoples of the far north, the Kuchki, Koryaki, and Kamchadal, and in the Islamic cultures in the Soviet republics, revealed the fault line. Preobrazhensky argued that the origins of the widespread expression of same-sex love in these cultures, enjoying ancient acceptance, was not biologically based, but, quote, to a significant extent bear a social character, unquote. Historian Laura Engelstein in Soviet Policy explains that by the second edition of the 1930 encyclopedia, the editors, quote, denounced homosexuality as a feature of capitalist society, in which they asserted homosexuality was left de facto unpenalized, unquote. The question is why? In what soil were these changes rooted? Economic, military pressure cooker. Famine and military and economic warfare by world capital were burning the revolutionary fuel of the population and the left wing of the Bolshevik Party at a rapid rate in the 1920s. The subsequent need to build an industrial base with the speed of lightning, at the sacrifice of civilian goods and services for the vast tens of millions, was requisite in order to defend the USSR militarily and lay the foundation for a rise in the overall living standard. The industrial component of the first five-year plan, steel and machinery production, coal mines and oil fields, exceeded expectations. Begun in 1929, the goals were met in 1932, before the plan's end date. A second plan was set in motion in 1934. The transportation network grew, beginning to link the vast country. Canals were dug, and the Moscow Metro began running in 1935. This industrial boom and its accomplishments in the planned Soviet economy shone against the chaos of the Great Depression in the capitalist countries. But everything is relative. The USSR, the only worker state in the world, was trying to pull itself up out of extreme material underdevelopment and at the same time advance from semi-feudal social relations to ones more advanced than in the capitalist countries. This would have been a huge task even in times of peace. But, while the Depression in the West gave the USSR a breathing space for a few years, by 1933 it was clear that the revolutionary potential of the proletariat in Western Europe had been crushed, and that German imperialism was on the road to military expansion once again. By 1938, when Britain signed the Munich Pact with Germany, Italy, and France, it was because the democratic imperialists in Europe were giving Germany the go-ahead to expand eastward. Another war was on the horizon. The Soviet Union had to industrialize at breakneck speed, much of it channeled into military defense of the workers' state. In the face of relative scarcity and economic inequality, and an urgent need for the skills acquired during the Tsarist era in order to build the economic and military infrastructure, more conservative elements gained ascendancy on the shop floor and in the Bolshevik Party. The working class was increasingly politically disenfranchised, and the worker democracy that Lenin and the left-wing Bolsheviks had tried to foster, even during wartime conditions, suffered. The state could not wither away. In fact, military spending and social prioritizing took its toll on efforts to build socialism and advance revolutionary consciousness building. In this economic, military, and political pressure cooker, official attitudes shifted, bolstering old prejudices against women and reinforcing ideals of gender expression. So commenting, I guess you could say that even though the USSR had broken away from the world capitalist system, it still existed on the same planet as the world capitalist system, and the world capitalist system was still capable of putting enough pressure on the USSR, even from outside, and then of course there was the internal former bourgeoisie, to slow the revolution dramatically. Continuing. Masculine professions movement. Economic underdevelopment and the need to free men for military defense had spurred the massive recruitment of women into the process of rapid industrialization as early as the first five-year plan. To do so required confronting gender stereotyping of skilled work. Acquired skills were viewed as socially, quote, masculine. The temporary reintroduction of some capitalist relations within the planned economy in 1921, known as the New Economic Policy, was designed to help stimulate the economy. Lenin had warned of the risks inherent in this measure. One result of the NEP was the emboldening of male managers and skilled workers who had acquired their trade during the Tsarist period. As they regained some shop floor predominance, they tried to block women from gaining these skills, defining mechanical ability as a, quote, masculine trait. However, notes historian Thomas T. Schrand, quote, as the USSR began mobilizing for war with Poland and Finland in September 1939, the party instructed union, Komsomol, and industrial organizations to support the so-called masculine professions movement, which aimed to recruit women into the fields that had previously been considered too skilled or physically demanding for women. In anticipation of a military crisis that would drain off skilled male workers, industrial officials began encouraging women to work as locomotive engineers, engine machinists, open hearth furnace workers, and to enter other occupations from which they had previously been excluded, unquote. But rather than emphasizing the need to employ women as part of the revolutionary process of liberating them, the official explanation now was that recruiting women workers would free men to defend the socialist state. The military motto used to describe this industrial shift was, quote, work that strengthens the rear of production, which assures the uninterrupted and precise work of production itself, unquote. The slogan also elevated a tactic to a theory, and one that contained a theoretical error at that. In reality, as important as the front lines of armed defense of the workers' state were, they were not producing goods and services. Workers in the industries of the USSR, more than 10 million of them women, were the front lines of production. Gender contradiction, old alongside the new. During the second five-year plan, 1932 to 1937, an estimated 82% of all new workers joining industry were female. The birth rate was dropping. On the one hand, old patriarchal family values reemerged against this backdrop of economic and social upheaval. During the 1930s, health studies and legislation protecting industrial laborers focused on the impact specific jobs involving heavy lifting or tractor driving had on women's reproductive capacities. While this shows a concern for women workers, similar studies were not done on the hazards of jobs, no matter how dangerous, on men's reproductive capabilities. This trend toward encouraging all women to be mothers reached its zenith in 1936, when abortion and the sale of contraceptives were banned. Women received economic incentives and medals for bearing 7 or more children. Pravda criticized, quote, so-called free love and, quote, all disorderly sex life. Femininity was upheld as a virtue. However, Healy noted, women viewed as masculine or lesbian were not demonized or pathologized. In political educational campaigns, soldiers were portrayed as masculine heroes, women as feminine producers and reproducers. From a class standpoint, the working class as a whole was portrayed as masculine and the peasantry as feminine. However, even as old thinking was regenerated, new and profound social changes were breaking like waves. Healy writes that as women peasants, collective farmers, and urban workers were called up in massive numbers during the 1930s to enter public life and wage labor, quote, women in these spheres were compelled and encouraged to emancipate themselves from patriarchal fathers and husbands, who were not to stand in the way of their progress toward careers beyond the home, unquote. But specifically and concretely, how and why did these social, economic, and military conditions specifically warp a sector of official attitude regarding homosexuality beginning in 1933? These questions have vital meaning today because this political backsliding is held up by virtually all anti-communist historians of the period as, quote, proof that socialism is not viable to liberate human sexuality from state regulation. It's time for the communist movement as a whole to become expert on these developments and to lay claim to the historical lessons in order to fortify its own revolutionary analysis. Part 16. Can a homosexual be a member of the Communist Party? Years before the actual 1933 law recriminalizing male homosexuality appeared on the books in the Soviet Union, the shift in official attitude within the ascendant political current was becoming apparent. The political error evolved out of how scientists and jurists posed the, quote, nature versus nurture debate in regard to homosexuality. But what fed the ideological problem were the deep prejudices left over from centuries of unequal and unjust economic relations, some of which were revived as the revolution, isolated and embattled, struggled to survive. Furthermore, there were no cross-cultural, cross-historical annals of ancient evidence from which to draw a materialist view of how variance in human sexuality gender expression, and sexes has been present in all societies and was once accepted. And to be fair, the same debate about a biological versus social explanation for homosexuality was taking place on a world scale among progressive sexologists of that epoch. Some of the leading activist figures of the German homosexual emancipation movement were arguing that homosexuality was a biological anomaly. While the debate in the Soviet Union may have taken the same form, however, context is everything in politics. In Germany, a significant segment of the biological determinist wing of science and medicine would go on to, quote, justify the fascist state's extermination of millions of people based on a eugenics argument that these, quote, birth defects should be eradicated. The opposite happened in the Soviet Union. The revolution brought increasing tolerance for those whose difference was believed to be a product of birth chemistry. At the same time, lawmakers and scientists worked to eradicate what they believed was harmful social conditioning left over from class society. For example, in October 1917, revolutionary Bolsheviks abolished the Tsarist anti-homosexual law. The Soviet Criminal Code, established in 1922 and amended in 1926, did not include homosexuality as an offense. This reflected the belief that science, not law, should deal with matters of sexual difference. Historian Laura Engelstein summarized, quote, Soviet sexologists in the 1920s participated in the international movement for sexual reform, and criminologists deplored the use of penal sanctions to censor private sexual conduct, unquote, quoting from Sexual History of the Political Left. But conversely, laws were passed against sodomy and the prostitution of young, cross-dressed, feminine boy dancers in the Soviet republics of Azerbaijan in 1923, Uzbekistan in 1926, and Turkmenistan in 1927. While in part aimed against sexual exploitation, they were explained as trying to eradicate the prevalence and acceptance of homosexuality and trans expression that were, quote, survivals of primitive custom, unquote, quoting from Homosexual Desire by Dan Healy. This attitude, steeped in unexamined national chauvinism, was summed up by P. Preobrazhensky in his appendix to the 1930 Great Soviet Encyclopedia, in which he argued that the origins of homosexuality among the peoples of the far north or the Asian republics, quote, bear a social character, not a biological root. Two-line struggle. The same two-line struggle surfaced in science. It was glaringly apparent in a 1929 conference of the leading Soviet medical body, the Expert Medical Council of the Commissariat of Health, held to discuss questions of homosexuality, cross-dressing, transsexuality, and intersexuality. Historian Dan Healy writes that underlying the 1929 Council's deliberations, quote, was a sense that the male member of the intermediate sex was the product of nurture, of conditions of social life or lifestyle gone wrong. These were deviations that were evidently preventable, except in a small number of congenital cases. Their sense of the female transvestite was more deeply biologized and intractable. No hormonal injections could apparently restore her femininity, and indeed, to doctors it appeared that society might have to adjust to the female transvestite by conceding same-sex marriage, unquote. In the nature versus nurture scientific debate, however, those seeking a biological explanation for social phenomena were losing the ideological battle. According to Healy, a political struggle opened up against biologizing scientists, charging that to search for the basis of social ills in individual biology was a form of Menshevik idealism. This campaign against biologizing was rooted in the economic needs of the 5-year plan to rapidly industrialize and raise agricultural production, Healy explained. Quote, the pragmatic turn in public health was signaled by a change of leadership and a shakeup in the provision of medical care. A reorganization of the Commissariat of Health was ordered by a decree of the Central Committee of the Communist Party on 13 December 1929, directing the Commissariat to place more emphasis on the needs of industrial workers and collectivized farmers, unquote. As a result, for instance, the Interdepartmental Commission, which came out of the 1929 Medical Conference and had planned to meet about transgender expression, no longer even existed by 1933, and science increasingly lost its dominion over social questions like homosexuality, which became more relegated to the realm of the state. Gay-baiting class enemies. Extra-legal raids in Moscow and Leningrad, in which 130 males were arrested in late summer 1933, were the harbinger of the recriminalization of male homosexuality later that year. The men were accused of being pederasts, adult males who have sex with boys. Since no records of men having sex with boys at that time are available, it is possible that this term was used broadly and crudely to label homosexuality, comment, as it still is in backward cultures today. Continuing, Healy examined what was going on in the Soviet Union in 1932 and 1933 that led to these raids and the subsequent law. Large-scale attempts to collectivize agriculture were met by such resistance among the peasants that a mass famine developed in Ukraine and southern Russia, which reportedly claimed 3 to 5 million lives. Millions of peasants were pouring into the cities from the countryside, looking for work in the factories. Quote, "The flow of new arrivals in the cities ruralized them," Healy observed, bringing thousands of new residents who knew little of urban and industrial ways, unquote. Officials carried out a purge of the Communist Party in December 1932 to 1933, scrutinizing the ranks, which had seen an influx of worker and peasant members. Quote, "In 1933, urban male homosexuals would fall within the larger net of these trends. In the case of this group, international developments also significantly contributed to justifications for the decision to recriminalize sodomy," unquote. Massive military conscription campaigns for defense of the Soviet Union had been underway since 1928. They promoted the role of soldiers as hyper-masculine heroes. Reports of homosexuality in the German fascist leadership had been made public in 1931 and 1932. The more conservative current in the Soviet Party, which had by then assumed the reins of leadership, gay-baited the fascists, as did the imperialist powers. On September 15, 1933, shortly after German-Soviet relations were severed by the rise of Hitler to power, G.G. Yagoda, deputy chief of the Soviet political force, proposed the stricture against male homosexuality. Yagoda reportedly wrote to Joseph Stalin that the legislation was a matter of state security because of the establishment of, quote, "networks of salons, centers, dens, groups, and other organized formations of pederasts, with the eventual transformation of these organizations into outright espionage cells. Pederast activists, using the caste-like exclusivity of pederastic circles for plainly counter-revolutionary aims, had politically demoralized various social layers of young men, including young workers, and even attempted to penetrate the army and navy," unquote. Stalin then allegedly forwarded this letter to his Politburo associate L. Kaganovich, saying that, quote, "these scoundrels must receive exemplary punishment and a corresponding guiding decree must be introduced in our legislation," unquote. At no point was lesbianism raised. Masculine lesbians in the ranks and leadership of the military were seen as strong and loyal. Feminine male homosexuals were viewed as weak and untrustworthy. Comment, "This is an extension of patriarchal thinking." In other words, being more masculine than you're expected to be is good. Being less masculine than you're expected to be is bad. Continuing. On January 11, 1934, the Ukraine, the second largest republic in the USSR, became the first republic to incorporate a statute against public homosexuality and male prostitution in its penal code. No minimum sentence was set. And in 1933 and 1934, a prohibition against male homosexuality throughout the USSR, which created a 5-year prison penalty, was passed without public fanfare or explanation. In a study of 8 Moscow trials of males accused of public homosexuality from 1935 to 1941, only one case in 1935 showed awareness of the new law. Can a homosexual be a party member? The most publicly raised voice of the left-wing opposition to this legal move was that of a British communist living in Moscow. Harry White, an editorial employee of the Moscow Daily News, challenged Stalin on the decree in a long letter received in May 1934. Quote, White's long missive opened with a question for Stalin. Can a homosexual be considered a person fit to become a member of the Communist Party? The journalist laid out Marxist arguments against the blanket prohibition of sodomy, which he claimed introduced unwarranted contradictions in Soviet social life by imposing sexual leveling on a harmless minority and by ignoring science on the issue, unquote, quoting from Homosexual Desire. White also drew analogies with arbitrary discrimination against women, national minorities, and people of color. The letter, once received, was promptly archived. Yet, it was a continuation of the history of left communist struggle for a progressive position. While publicly ignoring White's letter, Stalin apparently turned to cultural icon Maxim Gorky. An article by Gorky entitled Proletarian Humanism appeared in both Pravda and Izvestia on May 23, 1934. In that now oft-cited article, Gorky offered the, quote, first public explanation of the recriminalization of male homosexuality, and it placed the question squarely within the terms of the propaganda war between fascism and communism, unquote, quoting from Homosexual Desire. Gorky maintained that homosexuals were not a social minority that needed to be defended in a workers' state, an obvious polemic against white. Quote, in the land where the proletariat governs courageously, this word is sometimes also translated as manfully, and successfully, homosexuality, with its corrupting effect on the young, is considered a social crime punishable under the law. By contrast, in the, quote, cultivated land of the great philosophers, scholars, and musicians, Gorky meant Germany, it is practiced freely and with impunity. There is already a sarcastic saying, destroy homosexuality and fascism will disappear, unquote, quoting from Soviet policy toward male homosexuality. Comment that didn't hold up so well, considering that the Nazis put homosexuals in camps. Continuing, gay-baiting class enemies. In addition to gay-baiting fascists and fascist-baiting homosexuals, currents of officialdom also used epithets of effeminacy and effete, homosexuality, to label elements of the old ruling classes and to help build the image of the proletarian society and its soldiers as hypermasculine. Justice Commissar Nikolai Krylenko referred to the anti-gay law in his 1936 speech to the party's Central Executive Committee as aimed at, quote, the remnants of enemies who do not wish to admit that they are doomed by history to finally concede their place to us, unquote. These charges were also leveled at political opponents. Some presumably were not enemies of the revolution, and some were. For example, Nikolai Kliuev, the unofficial poet laureate of the peasantry who wrote openly about being a homosexual, was arrested on February 2, 1934, and charged with counter-revolutionary agitation. He had earlier refused a demand by Ivan Gronsky, chief editor of Izvestia, to, quote, write normal verses. But his arrest, Healy wrote, was, quote, probably because of the inflammatory invective of his poems denouncing collectivization, unquote. Certainly the visible social current of the people of the moonlight in Russian history had always come from the upper classes and the intelligentsia, musicians, dancers, literati, and others. But the point is not to untangle the knotted charges of homosexuality and subversion. The real matter is that it is flat out wrong to link the issues. Homosexuality and transgender expression appear in all economic classes in society. Communists need to be able to stand up against all forms of discrimination and prejudice in waging the class struggle. Strengthen the union, don't bust it. A great deal of information about the Stalin period has been lost today. The Soviet Union was ravaged by World War II, worker democracy was eroded, and a counter-revolution finally overturned the worker state in 1991. But what is clear is that the left-wing leadership of Lenin and the Bolshevik Party carried out a profound revolution that uprooted the private ownership of social wealth and laid the basis for socialist construction. It was immediately assailed by the whole capitalist world, when, after years of imperialist and civil war, which exacerbated the economic isolation and technological underdevelopment, the revolutionary momentum waned and left-wing leaders were suppressed. What was needed was political renewal, not counter-revolution. Every rank-and-file labor militant today who is faced with bureaucratic leadership in their union knows what's needed is not to bust up the union, but to make it stronger. The population of the Soviet Union did fight for its existence and fought hard. More than 20 million gave their lives to defend the worker state against the German imperialist invasion in World War II. And despite all the problems and weaknesses of the USSR and the errors of leaders, on March 17, 1991, some 75% of the Soviet people, representing the 15 republics of the USSR, went to the polls and voted not to allow the worker state to be dismantled. The highest percentage of this vote came from the peoples of Central Asia and the Caucasus, formerly oppressed under Tsarism. Yet world imperialism and the Russian moneyed class trampled on this exercise of worker democracy by dismantling the workers' state soon thereafter. Every error from the Soviet period, including the backward law against homosexuality, was used as an excuse and cover to overturn the state. But the aim was not liberation. It was to subject the vast population of the USSR to the exploitation of the capitalist world market. Today, the modern struggle for world socialism can be strengthened through an honest analysis of the problems and weaknesses that developed in the first successful workers' state, but only if it thoroughly rejects the anti-communism behind so much of the existing criticism.